Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today I will be painting the iconic orange armor of Jing in Corvus Belli's Infinity, and I'll try to get as close as possible to the box art. If you guys have already watched my first Infinity painting video, in which I was painting a Pano Knight of Justice, you know that the first miniature that made me interested in Infinity was actually a Jing tag. If you haven't seen that video, you definitely should, and it should pop up in the right corner right about now. The thing is that my expectations are so high for that model that I really wanted to try out the color scheme first on something a bit smaller before tackling the big boy. So today I am painting a Hsien warrior to figure out how I can get as close as possible to that beautiful box art so that I can replicate it on the tag later. Before I started painting, I looked up how the official box art armor was painted and managed to find most of the paints in my collection, except one, but I figured that I can solve that quite easily. I didn't have any of the paints necessary for the emerald green coat, but I wasn't too worried about that since I had a plan for it. And as with most plans, it didn't survive first contact with reality, but I came up with an even better solution in the end. As you just saw, I primed the model black, and this time I did not bother with the zenithal highlight. The reason for that is that I wanted to be as time efficient with the paint job as possible. So instead of applying a midtone and then shading and highlighting the model, I wanted to build up the color from the darkest shadow to the brightest highlight without any additional shading steps later. Turns out that this worked quite well, and I managed to finish everything in about 4.5 hours or so. I will probably be faster next time, since now I already know what to do and I can skip some of the experimentation I still needed to do here. The first color I used is Cavalry Brown from Vevor. This is an orange brown with great coverage that will serve as our shadow color, which means that there was very little need for me to let the black show through. I simply covered 95% of the armor panels fully with this color. I used it in a base color consistency, so slightly watered down to achieve a smooth finish in a couple of coats. The next color was tricky, since in the official color scheme they used orange brown from Vevor, which I didn't have. I was debating using Scrag Brown from Citadel at first, but in the end I simply mixed Cavalry Brown and Scrofulous Brown first in a 60-40 and later in a 40-60 mix to achieve this intermediate highlight. I thinned this mix down quite a bit and glazed it over the shadow color to create a transition on the panels. I made sure to highlight towards the light and to make the upward facing panels brighter by applying more highlights on those areas. I also started applying edge highlights on basically all the panels with these mixes. I took care not to cover my shadow color fully on the panels and keep it almost completely intact in the crevices and the shadowy areas, so I maintain a nice contrast between the dark and the light areas of the model. The next highlight was quite easy since I had the color I needed, pure Scrofulous Brown. I was doing the same thing as before, but now on a smaller surface and concentrating my edge highlights more on the upward facing edges. The added benefit of having the Scrofulous Brown in the previous mix is that it's much easier to blend the two layers together since the highlight is brighter, but almost the same shade. Finally, I started mixing some ice yellow from Vallejo into the Scrofulous Brown and did the same thing as before again, but on an even smaller surface inside my previous highlight and emphasizing the upward facing edges even more. Normally I would have needed to smoothen the transition between the current and the previous step more, but these colors actually blended quite nicely and I paid attention to keep my paint at a glaze consistency and applying multiple coats instead of rushing it and creating a harsh boundary between the colors. I could have smoothed things out even further with a couple of extra hours, but that would make it hard for me to replicate this scheme on a dozen models, so this will have to do for now. At this point, I was quite happy with how the armor looked, and I wanted to tackle the next big feature of the model, the emerald cloak. Since I didn't have any of the colors used in the original scheme, at first I wanted to stay with Vallejo paints and see what I can do with what I have and some mixing. I used some dark sea blue for the base color and then tried some blue-green to highlight it. This, probably not too surprisingly, turned out bluish more than greenish, so I tried mixing in some greens, but it simply didn't look right. So I let it sit for a while I was finishing the armor, hoping to figure it out later. Fortunately, at some point I glanced at one of my Sons of Horus models in my Horus Heresy army and realized that the paints I used there are exactly what I needed to get the bluish green of the coat in the box art. So first I started glazing in some Cabolite green from Citadel, and then a mix of Cabolite green and Sybarite green, mostly concentrating on the upward facing parts of the coat, like the upper edges of the folds and the shoulders and arms of the model. Finally, I finished it off with some pure Sybarite green. I didn't want to go brighter than that, since the orange armor is supposed to be the centerpiece of the model and the coat is there to give it a nice frame, so I figured I should highlight it a bit less. The final big section of the model was the metallic bits. There are not so many on this model as on some of the other Jing figures, but I also painted some of them orange instead of metallic in my interpretation. I just liked the colors so much I couldn't help myself, I guess. This meant that I could go for a relatively simple and quick non-metallic metal here, but I will probably have to do better on the bigger models. I use my go-to non-metallic metal paints for these parts from scale 75. Eclipse Grey for the shadows, and then highlights with Anthracite Grey, Graphite, and finally Nacre. If you want to see a more detailed guide on how to do the non-metallic parts, check out the previous videos on the channel. All that remained was to finish some of the smaller elements of the model, like the glowing green eyes, the pistol holster, and the grey bands around his shoulder, and finish the base with some dry rust pigment. And the end result looks like this. How close do you guys think I managed to get to the box art? In the end, this was a super fun scheme, and the orange of the armor goes extremely well with the emerald coat. The best part is that, strictly speaking, I didn't use a single orange color for the orange armor. Let me know what you would like me to paint next, and as usual, if you like the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel if you are interested in similar content in the future. See you in the next one.